Lone Modoc hunted for someone to aid his wailing infant, until a poor servant offered her breast, and— Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The winds howled through the trees, rattling the branches of the dense forest. In the distance, the faint sound of horses' hooves echoed through the mountains. A Modoc warrior, his face grim and covered in dust, pushed his weary horse forward. In his arms, he cradled a child, the infant's cries sharp and desperate. The Modoc's heart beat in time with the baby's wails, a sound that pierced through the silence of the wilderness. His eyes scanned the path ahead, knowing that the enemy was closing in. The child's cries were a beacon, a call for help, but there was no one to answer. He had been running for hours, dodging the enemy, but now, the weight of the child in his arms felt heavier than ever. His mind raced. How could he keep this child safe? How could he protect the innocent life in his arms when he was alone and outnumbered? His thoughts were interrupted as the sound of galloping hooves grew louder. The enemy was closer now. His heart clenched as he realized the grim reality. If they caught him, the child would never survive. The Modoc warrior urged his horse faster, but the child's cries grew louder, more frantic. The baby's cries were not just a plea for help. They were a cry for survival, a desperate call that tugged at the warrior's heart. He knew that he couldn't outrun the enemy forever. They would catch him, and when they did, there would be no mercy. As he approached a clearing in the woods, he spotted a small cottage in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney. It was a place of safety, a place he had passed before but had never thought to stop. But now, it was his only hope. He pushed his horse forward, urging it toward the cottage. He could feel the enemy's presence behind him, their pursuit relentless. He had no time to waste. He reached the cottage, his horse's hooves kicking up dust as he approached the door. He dismounted quickly, clutching the infant to his chest. His mind was clouded with fear, but he knew he had to act fast. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling as he held the child. The door creaked open, and a woman appeared, her face startled but kind. Her eyes widened as she saw the warrior, his clothes tattered, his face smeared with dirt. But it was the child in his arms that caught her attention. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. "Help me. The child, she is in danger. They are chasing us." The woman hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Quickly, the Modoc warrior stepped into the cottage, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. He could hear the baby's cries echoing through the room, and the woman rushed to take the child from his arms. As she held the baby, her eyes softened. "She is very sick," the woman said, her voice filled with concern. "You did the right thing bringing her here." The warrior nodded, his mind still racing. But there was no time to waste. The enemy was near. "They will be here soon," he said urgently. "I need to protect her. I need your help." The woman looked at him, her eyes calm but determined. "I will help you," she said. "But you must trust me." The warrior nodded again, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He had no choice but to trust this stranger. The woman began to tend to the child, her hands moving with practiced ease as she tried to calm the baby's cries. The warrior watched, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. His thoughts drifted to the child's future, to the life she would lead if they survived. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what had brought her to this point. But in that moment, he knew that he would do whatever it took to protect her. The woman looked up at him, her face pale but resolute. "We need to hide her," she said softly. "They cannot. Find us here." The warrior nodded, his mind already working on a plan. The baby's cries were slowly quieting, but he knew they had little time before the enemy arrived. They had to move quickly, or they would all be lost. The Modoc warrior stood by the window, his eyes scanning the horizon through the small crack in the wooden shutters. His breath was steady, but his mind was anything but calm. The woman, whom he had never met before, had taken the child from his arms, tending to her with a calmness he did not expect. She was an unexpected savior in this unforgiving wilderness, someone who could help where no one else would. But he knew the danger wasn't over. Outside, the wind howled as the enemy approached. He could hear their distant shouts, their horses' hooves pounding against the dry earth. He glanced at the woman, who was now rocking the child gently in her arms, whispering soft words in a language he did not understand. He needed to protect them both. There was no time to waste. The woman seemed to sense his anxiety. "You're worried about the men who are chasing you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They'll come, but we have time to prepare." The warrior nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his side. The weight of it was reassuring, but he knew it wouldn't be enough if the enemy found them here. "We must leave soon," he said. "They won't stop until they find us." The woman looked at him with understanding, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "I have a place," she said after a moment. "It's deep in the forest, hidden from sight. If we can get there, they won't find us." She stood up, carefully placing the child in a cradle she had made from an old blanket. "But it's dangerous. The forest is wild, and the path is treacherous." The warrior's mind raced. "I will follow you," he said, his voice low and determined. "We can't stay here." The woman nodded and walked toward the door. "Stay close," she said, "and do exactly as I say. The forest will test you, but we have no choice." They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their faces. The warrior kept his eyes fixed on the woods, where the sounds of the approaching enemy grew louder. He knew they had little time before the enemy arrived. The woman moved swiftly, leading him down a narrow path hidden by thick brush. The forest around them seemed alive, the trees casting long shadows that moved in the wind. The warrior's instincts told him to be on guard. Every step, every movement, could mean the difference between life and death. As they moved deeper into the forest, the warrior felt a sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in on them, the path growing steeper and more difficult to navigate. He could hear the sounds of their pursuers now, closer, louder, and more urgent. The woman glanced back at him, her face tense. "Keep going. We're almost there." They pushed forward, the trees around them growing thicker, the underbrush more tangled. The warrior stumbled once, but caught himself quickly, glancing up to make sure they weren't being followed. He could feel the enemy getting closer, could sense the hunt closing in around them. Finally, the woman stopped. "This is it," she said, pointing to a small clearing ahead. There, hidden beneath the overhanging branches of a massive oak tree, was a cave entrance. It was barely noticeable, almost camouflaged by the surrounding foliage. The warrior's heart raced as they approached. The woman moved first, ducking into the cave and gesturing for him to follow. He crouched low, entering the dark space. Inside, it was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. He could hear the child's faint cries again, but they were softer now, as if the baby had begun to calm. The woman laid the child down on a bed of leaves she had prepared, her hands moving with careful precision. The warrior stood guard near the entrance, his senses on high alert. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were safe, for now. But how long would that safety last? How long before the enemy found them? His thoughts were interrupted by the woman's voice. "We'll wait here. If they find us, we'll fight. But for now, we need to rest." He nodded, but his mind was still racing. He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. As the hours passed, the warrior's thoughts wandered back to the child. Who was she? Why was she in danger? And why had the woman helped him when she had no reason to? But he knew that now was not the time to ask questions. Their survival depended on staying hidden, on waiting for the right moment to act. The wind outside began to pick up, the leaves rustling in the trees. The woman settled next to the child, her eyes closing as she rested for a moment. The warrior remained vigilant, his hand never straying far from his weapon. He would protect them both, no matter the cost. As the night drew on, the sounds of the forest filled the cave. The distant howls of wolves, the rustling of the trees, the occasional cry of an owl. It was a reminder of how harsh the world outside could be, and how fragile their situation was. The warrior stayed alert, watching the entrance to the cave. He knew the enemy could be anywhere, and at any moment, they might be forced to flee again. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. "I know they are coming." The thought echoed in the warrior's mind as he crouched by the entrance to the cave, his eyes scanning the darkened forest outside. His senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the faint howl of wolves far off in the distance. But nothing could shake the heavy feeling that settled deep in his chest, the feeling that the enemy was drawing closer. His grip tightened on the hilt of his knife as he listened, his heart beating loudly in his chest. He had to protect them, the woman and the child, his responsibility now. He had come for the child, but the woman had shown him kindness when no one else would. She had taken them in, cared for them without question, without hesitation. He owed her his life now. He glanced over his shoulder at her, where she sat beside the infant. Her brow was furrowed, her eyes distant, yet focused. She had been so calm, so composed since they entered the cave. She had a strength about her that the warrior had not expected. For a brief moment, he wondered what her story was, what had brought her to this remote place, alone and without fear. But there was no time to ask questions now. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, soft at first, but unmistakable in the quiet of the night. His eyes snapped back to the entrance. He tensed, ready to spring into action, ready to protect them at any cost. But the woman seemed to sense it too. She stood, moving quietly toward the back of the cave where the child lay. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and she nodded once, her expression determined. They had prepared as best they could, but now the real test was here. The warrior's instincts took over. He gestured for her to stay back, and crept toward the entrance. His breath slowed as he crouched, his eyes narrowing. The figures outside were faint, shadows in the moonlight. There were 4 of them, their movements deliberate. They were close, too close. He could hear their voices now, low and tense, discussing their next move. His heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea if they had already been spotted or if they were simply searching the area. But the warrior had no intention of finding out. He moved swiftly, silently, as he crept closer to the entrance. His hand found the cool steel of his blade, and his mind focused. There would be no hesitation. He would protect them, no matter the cost. The figures drew nearer, their voices growing louder. He could see their outlines now, 3 men and a woman, all armed, their faces hard and determined. They were close enough now that he could hear the scrape of their boots on the forest floor. He took a deep breath, adjusting his stance, preparing himself for what was to come. The moment they crossed the threshold of the cave's entrance, they would be within reach. And he would strike. Just as he began to move, a sudden, loud crack echoed through the trees, a twig snapping underfoot. The warriors froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the sound. The warrior held his breath, his muscles tensing. They had heard it. His heart beat faster as the moment of truth drew near. But instead of charging in, the figures turned and began to move away. The warrior watched in disbelief as they slowly retreated into the woods, the sounds of their footsteps fading into the distance. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Were they leaving? Were they abandoning the hunt? Or was this some sort of trick? The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the warrior waited for any sign that the figures would turn back. But they did not. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves around him, the world returning to its natural rhythm. Slowly, he exhaled, his grip on his knife relaxing. His heart was still pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. But for now, they were safe. The enemy was gone, at least for tonight. He glanced over his shoulder at the woman, who had watched the entire exchange silently, her face unreadable. The child was still sleeping soundly, tucked safely in the blanket she had made. The warrior took a step back into the shadows of the cave, his eyes never leaving the entrance. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. The woman approached him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" she asked. "They've gone," he replied quietly, his voice low and steady. "For now, we're safe." She nodded, her expression still tense, but she relaxed slightly. "We can't stay here long." "They'll come back," she said. He nodded in agreement, his mind already working on their next move. They couldn't stay here forever. They had to keep moving, keep hiding, keep surviving. But for now, they had won this small victory. And that, for the moment, was enough. "I know they will come back." The thoughts circled in the warrior's mind as he stood at the edge of the cave, his senses sharpened by the night's events. The enemy had retreated, but only for now. The woman beside him had already begun to prepare for their next move. She had insisted that they couldn't stay in the cave forever, that they needed to keep moving. Her calm demeanor hadn't wavered once during the whole ordeal, even when the enemy had been so close. She had shown him a strength he hadn't expected from someone who had lived so isolated. But there was no time for gratitude now. The baby lay peacefully in her arms, but the warrior knew their safety was fragile. He watched her, trying to read her expressions, but she kept her focus on the child, her hands gently brushing the baby's hair. "We need to go soon," the woman said, her voice steady as always. "They'll come back. We can't wait for them to find us here." The warrior nodded silently, his eyes scanning the dim light outside the cave. He had never imagined his journey would bring him to a place like this, relying on the help of a stranger. But here they were, together in this desolate wilderness, both determined to protect the innocent life they shared the burden of. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice low. The woman glanced back at him, meeting his gaze for the first time since they had entered the cave. "There is a small settlement," she said quietly. "It's not far. I know a way through the forest. We'll be safer there, for a while." The warrior felt the weight of her words, but he didn't hesitate. He trusted her. He had no choice but to trust her. They had no other option. The woman began to gather their things, preparing to leave the safety of the cave. The warrior could see the determination in her movements, as if this were a routine for her. She wasn't afraid. The warrior, however, felt the tension in his muscles tighten again. He had no idea what kind of danger lay ahead. All he knew was that he had to keep them both safe. As the last of their supplies were packed, the warrior motioned for her to go first. They moved quickly through the trees, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. He kept his hand on the hilt of his knife, his eyes scanning every movement in the shadows. He had to be ready for anything. The woman moved with surprising speed, leading them through the dense forest as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She navigated with confidence, her steps sure despite the thick underbrush. The warrior followed closely behind, his ears straining for any sign of pursuit. They hadn't gone far when the sounds of the forest seemed to shift. The wind died down, and all the usual noises of the wilderness seemed to fade into a silence that felt unnatural. The warrior's instincts screamed at him. He raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. The woman immediately halted, her eyes flicking to him, waiting for instructions. He didn't need to say anything. He motioned toward the trees ahead. Something was wrong. The woman stepped forward cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she peered into the darkness. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest as he followed her lead, his mind racing. He could hear something now, soft footsteps in the distance, moving in their direction. It was too quiet, too deliberate. They were being followed. His grip on the knife tightened. The woman's eyes met his again, and this time, she seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Without a word, she pulled the baby closer to her chest and crouched down behind a large rock, motioning for the warrior to do the same. They stayed low, the sounds of the forest still echoing around them. The warrior could feel his pulse in his ears as he waited, his eyes fixed on the dark shapes moving closer. The enemy was near, closer than he had hoped. He cursed silently. He had hoped they had lost them. But the warrior was not afraid. He had faced worse in his life. The question was, would he be able to keep them both safe in the coming moments? The footsteps grew louder, and the warrior's grip tightened on the knife, ready for whatever came next. He glanced at the woman, her face set with determination as she held the child close. He could see the fear in her eyes, but she didn't show it. She was ready for whatever they would face together. The sound of hooves broke the silence, and the warrior knew the enemy was closing in. He could feel the tension building, the moment of truth approaching. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they waited. Suddenly, one of the figures emerged from the trees, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. It was a man on horseback, moving slowly, as if searching for something. The warrior's heart skipped a beat. He had to act. Without thinking, he sprang forward, moving faster than he had ever moved before. The man on horseback looked up just in time to see the warrior charging toward him. He shouted, but it was too late. The warrior was already on him, his blade flashing in the moonlight as he struck. The man fell from his horse with a grunt, and the warrior moved swiftly to his side, ensuring he wouldn't rise again. The enemy was momentarily stunned, but it didn't take long for the rest of the men to react. The warrior turned to the woman, his voice harsh. Go? Now. He heard the sound of horses' hooves coming from all directions, and his pulse quickened. The woman nodded, grabbing the child and running in the opposite direction. The warrior followed closely behind, cutting through the trees, his every sense on edge. They had to escape, and they had to do it quickly. The night had turned into chaos, but in that chaos, there was still hope. They weren't finished yet. I know they are still coming. The warrior's heart raced as he led the woman and the child through the dense forest. The moonlight barely cut through the thick canopy above them, and the underbrush seemed to close in with every step. The silence between them was tense, broken only by the sound of their hurried footsteps. The woman, holding the child close, moved swiftly, her eyes darting around, constantly on alert. The warrior, too, remained vigilant, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened to its limit. They had to get to safety. This was their only chance. But as the hours stretched on, the weight of the situation began to press down on him. He knew they could not keep running forever. They had to find shelter, something more secure than the temporary hideout they had left behind. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The warrior could feel the sweat forming on his brow, but there was no time to wipe it away. The child's cries had subsided, but they had not disappeared. It was as if the baby, sensing the danger, held on to every sound, every movement, every brush of wind, as if it might be their last. The woman turned to him briefly, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. We need to stop, she said, her voice low but urgent. We can't keep running like this. He nodded without a word, his mind already scanning the landscape ahead of them. He knew of a small, abandoned cabin nearby. Nothing much, but it could offer them a few hours of rest, a brief respite from the dangers closing in around them. The warrior had passed it before, during his travels through the region. It was secluded, hidden by overgrown vines and thick underbrush. It was not much, but it would do for now. We'll make it there, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The woman said nothing but nodded, a silent agreement between them. They moved quickly, the cabin now in their sights. It wasn't far, but every step felt like a lifetime. The warrior's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The sounds of the forest around them had grown eerily quiet again, the stillness pressing in on them. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood, the warrior froze. He could hear them now, the soft creak of branches underfoot, the low murmur of voices. They were getting closer. His eyes darted to the woman, who had also stopped. Her face was pale, but her expression was firm. She knew the danger was near, but she said nothing. She trusted him. He motioned for her to stay low and moved toward the cabin, his steps silent against the ground. They would have to make it inside, and quickly. They slipped into the cabin, and the warrior closed the door behind them, the sound of the wind howling outside seeming louder now that they were inside. He pressed his back to the door, listening intently. The footsteps outside were unmistakable now. They were right outside the cabin. His heart pounded as he gripped the knife at his side. The woman placed the child gently on the floor and looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but also a quiet determination. They had no choice but to wait. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as they remained still, the sounds of the enemy outside growing louder. The warrior's eyes never left the door. He could feel the tension building inside him, a pressure that threatened to crush him if he didn't act. But he couldn't risk making a move too soon. The silence outside was deafening now, and then, suddenly, a loud crash. The door rattled as someone slammed into it from the outside, the force of the impact sending a shock through the warrior's body. He moved quickly, stepping in front of the woman and the child, his knife drawn. He could hear the voices now, closer than ever, as the enemy surrounded the cabin. His heart was racing, his mind focused on the task at hand. They couldn't survive if they were caught here. The enemy would tear the cabin apart to get to them. The warrior's eyes flashed as he prepared to defend them to the last breath. He could hear the leader's voice now, a harsh whisper just outside the door. They're inside. Find a way in. The warrior knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. His mind raced, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. They were trapped. The woman reached for the child, pulling her close to her chest, her eyes never leaving the warrior's face. The warrior's grip on his knife tightened, and he took a deep breath. This was it. They would either fight their way out of this, or they would die trying. The door rattled again, louder this time, and the warrior's pulse quickened. He couldn't let them break in. Not now. Not while they still had a chance. He took a step toward the door, his body coiled, ready to spring. The woman stood, her voice soft but firm. Don't let them get the child. The warrior nodded once, his expression hardening. He was ready. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The seconds stretched on, the tension so thick he could feel it in his bones. The enemy was so close now. And then, without warning, the door burst open. The warrior was already moving, his knife flashing in the dim light of the cabin as he met the first enemy head-on. The fight had begun. I know they will keep coming. The warrior's pulse raced as he stood, knife in hand, in the dim light of the cabin. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind focused entirely on the men now spilling through the door. The first one fell fast, a quick, clean strike to the throat, but the others were relentless. The warrior moved with practiced speed, dodging a slash from one of the attackers, his blade meeting the second man's chest with a sickening thud. He was swift, precise, he had to be. Every second counted. The woman was still behind him, holding the child close, her eyes wide with fear, but her stance unwavering. She knew they had to fight if they were to survive. The warrior's mind raced as he cut down another attacker, the blood splattering across the floor. The odds were stacking up against them, and yet, he couldn't afford to think about defeat. He could feel the enemy closing in, but he couldn't let them get the child. That thought kept him grounded, focused. Every time his blade sank into flesh, he reminded himself of why he was here. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to protect the innocence of the child in her arms. The last attacker lunged at him with a wild, desperate swing, but the warrior was faster. With a fluid movement, he sidestepped, thrusting his knife deep into the man's side. The attacker collapsed, blood pooling around him. The warrior stepped back, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the battle subsided. His eyes scanned the room, his body tense. They were safe, for now, but there was no time to waste. He turned to the woman, who was already moving toward the door. "We need to go," she said urgently, her voice steady despite the chaos. The warrior nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. They had no time to mourn their victory, no time to rest. They had to keep moving, keep running. The enemy wouldn't stop. The woman moved swiftly, cradling the child, and the warrior followed her, his knife still in hand. They left the cabin behind, the door creaking as it swung open, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the thick forest floor. The warrior led the way, his instincts guiding him as he navigated through the trees. The woman stayed close, her eyes scanning the shadows. They couldn't afford to stop. Every moment they spent in one place was another chance for the enemy to catch up. The forest felt alive around them, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a bird. The warrior's senses were on high alert, his eyes darting from side to side, always looking for danger. They moved swiftly, their path taking them deeper into the woods. The warrior's heart was heavy with the weight of the child's life in his hands. He couldn't let anything happen to her, not after everything they had been through. The woman's footsteps faltered behind him, and he turned to see her struggling to keep up. Her face was pale, and the child was beginning to stir in her arms. He knew she was exhausted, but they couldn't afford to slow down. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice firm but quiet. She nodded, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was on the brink of collapse, but she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. The warrior knew that feeling all too well. The drive to protect, to survive, no matter the cost. They continued on, their path winding through the dense woods. The sound of hooves reached their ears again, distant but unmistakable. The enemy was still out there, hunting them. He felt the weight of the moment press down on him. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, a place to hide, somewhere to rest. He glanced at the woman, her face set with determination, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. She was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for. She wasn't just some helpless woman with a child. She was a survivor, and she had already saved their lives. The warrior knew that they had to find safety soon, but time was running out. The sound of hooves grew louder, and he could feel his pulse quicken. They were getting closer. They had to make it to the river. If they could reach the river, they might have a chance to lose their pursuers in the currents. The warrior's mind raced as he picked up the pace, the woman following closely behind. They had no time to waste. The river was their only hope. As they reached the edge of the forest, the warrior's heart sank. The sound of hooves was now unmistakable. The enemy was right behind them. There was no time to reach the river. They were cornered. The warrior stopped, his body tense, his knife at the ready. The woman turned to him, her face filled with fear. He could see the panic in her eyes, but he knew there was no time for doubt. They had to fight again, or they would die here, in the woods, without ever having a chance. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "I'll protect you. I'll protect her." The woman nodded, clutching the child to her chest, her gaze never leaving him. The warrior stepped forward, his body coiled and ready. The enemy emerged from the trees, their horses crashing through the underbrush. This time, there would be no mercy. The warrior would make sure of that. "I can hear them now." The warrior's heart thudded in his chest as the sound of horses galloping grew louder. The enemy was closing in fast, the pounding hooves echoing off the trees and the wind carrying their scent on the air. His grip tightened on the hilt of his knife as he turned to face the woman, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the child to her chest, her face pale, but her expression unwavering. There was no time left to run, no more paths to take. The warrior stepped in front of her, his body poised and ready. He had promised to protect them both, and now, the time to deliver on that promise had come. He could feel his pulse in his ears, his instincts sharp as the blade in his hand. He had fought in battles before, faced countless enemies, but this was different. This was a fight for survival, for the life of an innocent child, and for the woman who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. The sounds of the enemy grew louder, their voices harsh and cruel as they shouted to each other. They were getting closer. He had no illusions about what would happen if they were captured. He had to make a stand, here and now. He turned to the woman, his voice low and calm. "Stay behind me," he said, his words carrying the weight of everything he felt in that moment. "I will protect you." She nodded silently, her grip on the child tightening. The warrior moved into position, his back against the tree, his knife raised in anticipation. He could hear them now, only a few feet away, their breath heavy with the promise of violence. There was no escape, no place to hide, but the warrior was ready. He had trained for this moment his entire life. He could hear the crackling of branches underfoot as the enemy drew near. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for the inevitable. He had no choice but to fight. The first man emerged from the trees, his face twisted into a cruel grin as he saw the warrior standing there, ready for him. The warrior didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he lunged forward, his knife slashing through the air. The man barely had time to react before the blade buried itself deep in his side. He gasped in surprise, his hand reaching for the wound as he crumpled to the ground. The warrior pulled his blade free, his eyes immediately shifting to the next threat. Two more men stepped into view, their eyes narrowing as they saw their fallen comrade. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was razor-sharp. He had no time for fear, no room for doubt. He moved quickly, his knife a flash of steel in the night. He struck the first man in the throat, the blow so quick and clean that he barely had time to make a sound before collapsing to the ground. The second man swung at him, but the warrior was already moving, ducking under the blow and countering with a deadly strike to his attacker's chest. The man gasped, blood spilling from the wound as he crumpled to the ground. The warrior stood over him, breathing hard, but his eyes never left the trees around him. There was still more to come, and they were getting closer. He glanced back at the woman, who was now crouched low, her eyes wide with fear, but her body steady. She hadn't run. She hadn't panicked. She had trusted him to protect her, and she had stayed. The warrior turned back to the path, his eyes narrowing as he heard more footsteps. They weren't alone. A few more men appeared, their faces twisted in anger as they saw their comrades lying dead on the forest floor. The warrior's grip tightened on his knife. This fight wasn't over. The men lunged forward, shouting in fury, but the warrior was already moving, his knife slicing through the air as he blocked and struck. He moved with precision, each movement purposeful and deadly. He could feel his body growing weary, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop, not when the woman and the child depended on him. With a swift motion, he took down one more man, his knife cutting through the air like a flash of lightning. The last man paused, his eyes scanning the warrior, his face filled with uncertainty. He was the leader, the one who had been orchestrating this attack from the start. The warrior could see the hesitation in his eyes, the fear of facing a foe who had already defeated his men. The leader snarled, his hand going to the gun at his side. "You'll die for this," he growled, but the warrior was already on him, his knife moving faster than the leader could react. In one smooth motion, the warrior struck, his blade sinking into the leader's chest with a finality that silenced the forest. The man fell, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. The warrior stood over him, panting heavily, his chest heaving with each breath. It was over. For now. The woman slowly stood up, her eyes locked on the warrior as she took a cautious step forward. Her face was pale, but there was a look of relief in her eyes. She stepped closer, the child still cradled in her arms, and met the warrior's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. The warrior nodded, his expression unreadable. He had done what needed to be done, but the night wasn't over, and neither was their journey. They had survived the first wave, but there was still more ahead. The warrior knew that they couldn't stay here for long. They needed to move. The enemy would be back, and they had no time to waste. He turned toward the forest again, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We need to go," he said. "Now." The woman nodded, and without another word, they disappeared into the woods, their only goal now survival. "I know we have to keep moving." The warrior's mind raced as they continued to slip through the dense forest, the shadows of the night growing longer with every passing moment. The sound of their pursuers had faded, but he knew they hadn't escaped them entirely. The enemy was out there, somewhere, waiting for them to make a mistake. He could feel it in his bones, the pressure, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. His eyes flicked to the woman beside him, her face still pale from the fight. She was doing her best to keep up, but the strain was beginning to show. The child, now silent, rested against her chest, her tiny body still and calm. The warrior's heart tightened at the sight. They had to get out of this alive. The woman, sensing his concern, glanced up at him and gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. She wasn't slowing down. Neither would he. They moved quickly, their footsteps soft against the forest floor, but the warrior knew it wouldn't be long before the enemy picked up their trail again. He had to keep them one step ahead. "We need to find shelter," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. The woman didn't reply but nodded, understanding the urgency in his words. They couldn't keep running forever. The warrior led them through the trees, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He had been through these woods before. He knew there were caves and abandoned cabins scattered throughout the area, places where they could take refuge. But they had to be careful. The enemy could be closer than they realized. As they reached a clearing, the warrior paused, his senses tingling with the awareness of a presence nearby. He motioned for the woman to stop, his hand held up in a silent signal. She froze instantly, her eyes wide as she scanned the surroundings. The warrior took a slow, steadying breath, his ears straining to catch any sound that might give away the enemy's position. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint rustling, a snap of a twig, someone was nearby. He gripped his knife tighter, ready to fight if necessary. But he couldn't afford to be reckless. They couldn't afford a fight they didn't need. He turned to the woman. "Stay behind me," he whispered. She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back into the shadows, clutching the child tightly. The warrior moved forward, his steps silent, his body poised for action. He knew the forest well enough to understand that it could either be his ally or his enemy. The slightest sound could give them away, and if they were spotted, they wouldn't have much of a chance. As he crept through the underbrush, the warrior's eyes darted between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. His breath was shallow, his senses alert to every rustle of leaves, every shift of air. Then he saw them, two figures, moving quietly through the trees. They were hunters, part of the group that had been tracking them for days. The warrior froze, his body tense. They hadn't seen him yet. He took a step back, carefully retreating into the shadows. His mind raced. They were so close now. Too close. He glanced back at the woman, whose face was now a mask of concern. She understood the danger. The warrior motioned for her to move, his eyes narrowing. They had to move quickly. before the enemy realized they were close. He was about to turn when one of the hunters spoke, his voice low but clear. "I swear I heard something. Over there." The warrior's blood ran cold. They had been spotted. The hunt was on. He turned to the woman. "Go," he said, his voice sharp. "Run. Get to the cabin." Without another word, he turned and bolted into the trees, moving as fast as he could. Behind him, he could hear the sound of footsteps crashing through the brush. His pursuers were closing in. He pushed harder, his breath coming in short bursts, his muscles burning from the effort. He had to get them to safety. He had to keep them ahead of the enemy. The sound of the footsteps behind him grew louder, and the warrior felt his heart pound in his chest. He was almost there, just a few more yards. Then, he saw it, a small cabin, hidden in a grove of trees. It was just ahead. His legs burned, but he pushed forward, his eyes locked on the structure. The woman would be there, waiting. He reached the cabin and slammed the door open, his chest heaving as he stepped inside. The woman was already there, the child cradled in her arms. She looked up at him, her face filled with relief. But the warrior didn't stop. He motioned for her to move. "Lock the door," he said urgently. "Hurry." She nodded and quickly went to the door, bolting it shut as the warrior turned to the window. He could hear the sounds of pursuit just outside, but for the moment, they were safe. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. They had made it. For now. The warrior stepped back from the window, his heart still racing. He turned to the woman, his voice soft but steady. "We have to rest. We can't keep running forever." She nodded, but the worry in her eyes was clear. They had bought themselves time, but how much time? The enemy was relentless, and sooner or later, they would find them again. But for tonight, they were safe. And that was all they had. They would have to prepare for whatever came next. I can hear them now. The faint sounds of hooves in the distance, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The enemy was still out there, and the warrior could feel the pressure mounting in his chest. It had been hours since they took refuge in the small cabin, but it felt like a lifetime. He had to focus. His body was sore from the battle earlier, but his mind wouldn't allow him to rest. He couldn't afford to. Not yet. The woman, who had proven herself more resilient than he could have imagined, sat by the window, her eyes scanning the darkened woods outside. The child was sleeping soundly in her arms, her tiny breath slow and steady, oblivious to the dangers surrounding them. The warrior looked at them both. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had led them into this, into a life of constant flight, constantly looking over their shoulders. He had promised to protect them, but with every passing hour, he wondered if he was enough. Would they make it out of this alive? Could he keep them safe? He turned back to the window, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. The sounds outside were getting closer. The enemy had tracked them here, but he was ready. They had no other choice but to fight. There was no way they would let him go without a fight, not after everything that had happened. The woman stood, her movements slow but purposeful. She glanced at him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "They're out there, aren't they?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes. She already knew. She had known from the moment they'd entered the cabin that this was not over. "We can't keep hiding forever," she said. "We have to do something." The warrior nodded. He had known this moment would come. There was no running anymore. They had no choice but to face the enemy head-on. He took a deep breath, his mind sharpening as he focused on the task at hand. "We'll fight," he said finally, his voice steady. "But we need a plan." The woman nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. "I'll hold the child," she said. "I won't run." The warrior looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise he had made to protect them both. But he couldn't allow them to fight. He wouldn't let them. He had to keep them safe. He had to be the one to face the enemy. He stepped back to the door, his hand resting on the knob. The woman was right. They had to face this head-on. The enemy wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But he wasn't going to let them take it from him. He turned to the woman one last time. "Stay inside," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Keep the child safe. I'll handle this." She opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head. "You've already done enough," he said. "Stay out of it." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and respect. She stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, her hand cradling the child protectively against her chest. The warrior turned back to the door, his body coiled and ready. He had no idea how many men were outside, but he knew one thing. It didn't matter. He would fight them all. He stepped out into the night, his knife at the ready, his heart beating in time with the soft rustle of the wind. The forest was eerily quiet as he moved forward, every step taking him closer to the battle that would determine their fate. He could see the figures now, moving through the trees, their shadows long and menacing in the pale moonlight. They were closing in. He could feel it in his bones. He crouched low, moving silently through the underbrush, his eyes fixed on the enemy. They were only a few feet away now. He could hear their whispers, their laughter. They thought they had won. They thought he was weak. He would show them how wrong they were. The warrior's breath was steady as he drew closer, his knife ready in his hand. He was no stranger to this kind of fight, but the stakes were higher now. It wasn't just his life on the line, it was theirs. The enemy stepped into view, their eyes scanning the trees. They were looking for him, but they wouldn't find him. Not yet. He waited until the last moment, then moved. He sprang forward, his knife flashing through the air as he struck the first man in the chest. The man fell without a sound, his body hitting the ground with a soft thud. The warrior moved quickly, taking down another attacker. With a swift slash to the throat, the others began to shout, their panic rising as they realized they were under attack. The warrior moved like lightning, his blade cutting through the air, his body fluid and precise as he struck again and again. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, the fear and doubt fading away. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to lose. The last man made a move for his gun, but the warrior was faster. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance, his knife sinking deep into the man's side. The enemy crumpled, and the warrior stood over him, his breath ragged. It was over. For now. The warrior took a step back, his eyes scanning the forest around him. The sounds of the fight had died down, but he knew they weren't alone. There were more out there. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. I can feel the tension in the air, thick like a storm waiting to break. The warrior's breath was steady, but his mind raced as he surveyed the aftermath of the skirmish. He had taken down the last of the attackers, but they both knew. This was far from over. The sound of hooves still echoed in the distance, the faint clattering of horse riders that signaled more danger was on the way. The warrior stood tall, wiping the blood from his blade as he scanned the forest around them. His senses were sharp, his ears listening for any movement, but the forest was unervingly quiet now. The woman had stayed behind the cover of the cabin, her eyes fixed on him, but there was no time to rest. No time to celebrate the small victory they had won. The enemy would be back. His heart still beat fast, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stay here another moment. He looked over his shoulder at the woman, who had moved closer, her face tense with concern but her posture steady. "Are we ready?" she asked, her voice low but filled with quiet strength. The warrior nodded. "We move now," he said firmly. He had been fighting to keep them both alive, but now it was time to fight for their freedom. The only way out was through the forest, deeper into the wilds. The woman nodded without hesitation, gathering the child into her arms once more. Her determination was unwavering. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior in her own right. They moved quickly, leaving the cabin behind, the warrior leading the way with his senses on high alert. Every step they took was a step into the unknown, and every crack of a branch, every distant noise, made his pulse race. He knew they had no time to waste. As they pushed through the dense underbrush, the sounds of hooves grew louder again, and this time, the warrior knew they weren't just riders passing through. They were coming for them. "They found us," he said, his voice calm but urgent. The woman's face was pale, but she nodded, clutching the child closer. She was ready. The warrior's mind raced. The path ahead was narrow, and it would be easy to trap them. They needed to get to higher ground, a place where they could see their enemies coming. He glanced at the trees, looking for the best route to take. There, an old ridge that climbed up the side of the hill. It wasn't far. If they could reach the ridge, they'd have a moment to assess the situation. But they had to be quick. They broke into a sprint, pushing their way through the trees, their feet silent against the earth, but their hearts pounding with the sound of their footsteps. The warrior could feel the enemy closing in. They were only moments away. As they reached the base of the ridge, the warrior motioned for the woman to stop. She quickly crouched down, hiding behind a thick tree trunk with the child in her arms. The warrior did the same, crouching low to the ground, his eyes scanning the area. His heart hammered in his chest, every muscle in his body tensed, and ready to spring into action. From their position, he could see the riders emerging from the forest, their horses crashing through the underbrush. They were getting closer. He counted 5 riders, all armed, moving with the determination of men who knew they had their prey in sight. The warrior's mind sharpened. He had only one chance to get them out alive. The woman was hidden, but the child would give them away if they weren't careful. He had to keep the enemy from spotting her. He looked at the woman, and she gave him a small, steady nod, silently agreeing to follow his lead. The warrior drew his knife and crawled forward, his body low to the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. He needed to get closer. The enemy was now only 20 yards away, their voices drifting through the air. The warrior couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough. They were looking for them. They were close. He didn't have much time. He waited, his breath steady, as the riders moved into position. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, shouted to his men, pointing toward the ridge. "They're close. Move in. We'll catch them at the top." The warrior's heart skipped a beat. They were going to take the ridge. He couldn't let them reach the top. It was their only advantage. The warrior's eyes flicked to the woman, then back to the men. He had to act now. He lunged forward, his knife raised high. The first rider didn't even see him coming. In one swift motion, the warrior struck, his blade cutting through the air and into the man's side. The rider fell from his horse, his body crumpling to the ground with a thud. The other riders shouted in alarm, but the warrior was already moving, his knife flashing again, taking down another man before they could react. The leader's eyes widened in fury as he saw his men fall, but the warrior was already on him, his blade aimed for the heart. The leader drew his gun, but the warrior was faster. He struck first, driving his knife deep into the man's chest. The leader gasped, his eyes wide with shock as he crumpled to the ground. The battle was over. For now. The warrior stood over the fallen men, his breath coming in sharp bursts, his heart pounding in his chest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He turned to the woman, motioning for her to move. "Go," he said. "We're leaving." They didn't have much time. The warrior knew the rest of the enemy would return soon. They needed to move now, while they still had the chance. "I know they won't stop." The warrior's heart was racing as they moved swiftly through the forest, every step a calculated risk, every crack of a twig underfoot threatening to betray their position. The woman was behind him, the child still in her arms, her face a mask of exhaustion but also determination. She had followed him through every moment, trusting him to lead them out of this danger, and he would not fail her now. The forest around them was dense, the trees thick with the sounds of night creatures, but the warrior's ears were attuned to something far more dangerous, the sounds of pursuit. He could feel the weight of their footsteps, the faint sound of hooves that had been growing nearer, and his pulse quickened. They were coming. The enemy was closing in. He turned his head briefly, his eyes flicking to the woman. "Keep going," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll hold them off." She nodded, her expression filled with quiet resolve. The warrior wasn't sure if she believed him, or if she was simply bracing herself for whatever came next. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let them catch them. They had to reach the river. The warrior knew the way. It was a small stream deep in the woods, an old path he had once traveled as a scout. If they could reach it, they could use the water to cover their tracks, to confuse the enemy. But it wasn't far enough yet, and the sound of the enemy's pursuit was unmistakable. He motioned for the woman to continue moving, leading her off the path and into the thick underbrush. She followed him, but he could see the child squirming in her arms, sensing the urgency, sensing the danger. He glanced back at her, his hand tightening around the hilt of his knife. "Stay close," he told her. "We don't have much time." They moved as silently as possible, but the warrior knew that it was only a matter of time before they would be spotted. The night air was cool against his skin, but his body was burning with adrenaline, every muscle coiled for the fight that he knew was coming. The woman was still moving with him, her eyes flicking between him and the dark shadows ahead. She was afraid, but she didn't show it. She didn't have the luxury of fear. He glanced up ahead, his senses alert. The trees were beginning to thin, and the faint sound of rushing water told him they were getting closer to the river. They would make it. They had to. Just as they broke through the last line of trees, the warrior stopped, his senses suddenly alert. He heard the hooves again, louder now, and he turned to see the enemy coming from both sides. The woman stopped beside him, her face pale, but her eyes focused, prepared for what was coming. "They're here," the warrior said, his voice steady. "We fight. We move fast." She nodded, her grip tightening around the child. The warrior stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't want to fight. Not here. Not now. But they had no choice. They had reached the river, and it was their only chance to escape. The first enemy rider appeared from the trees, his horse galloping toward them with a loud cry. The warrior didn't wait. He was already moving, his knife flashing in the dim moonlight as he struck the rider's horse, knocking the beast off course. The rider fell, crashing to the ground with a grunt, and the warrior was on him in an instant. He didn't hesitate, his blade finding its mark as the man struggled to draw his own weapon. The warrior moved quickly, taking the weapon from the fallen man's side, and turning to face the rest of the group. The sound of horses growing louder, he knew they wouldn't stop until they had them cornered. The next rider came at him with a shout, but the warrior was faster. He sidestepped the attack, slashing with his knife, cutting through the air. The man screamed in pain as he fell from his horse, clutching his side. But the warrior didn't stop. There were still more coming. The woman moved quickly behind him, clutching the child tightly as she took cover behind a large rock. The warrior's mind was focused, his body moving with practiced precision as he took down 2 more men. He could feel his strength waning, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't stop. Not now. The final enemy rider approached, his horse galloping full speed toward the warrior. The man was armed with a rifle, and the warrior knew he would have to move fast to avoid the shot. He ducked low, using the nearby boulder for cover. The rifle shot rang out, but it missed. The warrior surged forward, his body moving in a blur of speed as he tackled the rider off his horse. The man struggled beneath him, but the warrior's knife was already at his throat. He didn't give the man a chance to fight back. The warrior stood over him, his breath coming in heavy gasps, his body covered in sweat and blood. It was over. For now. He turned to the woman, his eyes meeting hers. They were both exhausted, but they had survived. They had fought, and they had won. But the warrior knew this was only the beginning. They had to keep moving. They had no choice but to keep running. "We have to cross the river," the warrior said, his voice hoarse. The woman nodded, her face still pale but filled with a quiet determination. Together, they moved toward the water's edge, the sound of the river rushing beside them. The warrior turned back one last time, glancing at the bodies of the fallen men. They had fought hard, but they had won. He could feel the weight of the child in his arms as he stepped into the river. The fight was far from over, but for now, they were safe. At least for tonight. I know they are still out there. The warrior's eyes scanned the dense forest as they crossed the river, the cold water rushing past their legs, a constant reminder of the dangerous journey ahead. The woman walked close beside him, the child still cradled in her arms, her body moving with a steady grace despite the exhaustion that was clearly taking its toll on her. The warrior could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to falter now. They had made it through the last fight, but the enemy was relentless. He could hear their voices in his mind, the threats, the shouts, the promise of more trouble. They would not stop. The warrior led the way, his instincts sharp as he guided them deeper into the forest. The sounds of the river faded behind them, replaced by the eerie silence of the trees. He knew they needed to find shelter, a place to rest, but every part of him was on high alert. The enemy could be close, and they would have to be prepared to fight again. The warrior looked to the woman. She was still moving with purpose, but her eyes were tired, her face pale. The child was quiet now, her little hands clutching the woman's cloak, but the warrior knew they had no time to waste. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steady but firm. The woman nodded, but the strain was evident in her movements. She was doing everything she could to stay strong, to keep going for the child. The warrior's heart ached for her, but there was no time for pity. They had to survive. They had to make it through the night. They pushed on, the trees closing in around them as they walked deeper into the forest. The warrior's thoughts were focused on one thing, keeping them both safe. But the forest wasn't just their ally. It was their enemy as well. The trees could hide them, but they could also trap them. Every step they took could be their last. The warrior kept his eyes on the path ahead, moving carefully, always listening, always watching. The sound of the forest shifted, the wind rustling the leaves in a way that made his skin crawl. He stopped, raising his hand to signal the woman. She froze immediately, her eyes meeting his in silent understanding. They weren't alone. The warrior's heart pounded in his chest. The sound of hooves was faint but unmistakable. They were being followed. He motioned for the woman to crouch down, her eyes wide with fear but filled with resolve. The child stirred in her arms, but the woman held her close, whispering soft words to calm her. The warrior stayed still, his breath shallow as he listened for any sound, any sign of movement. The enemy was close. Too close. He could hear them now, moving through the trees, their voices low but clear. He could sense their presence in the air. They were hunting. He gripped his knife tighter, his muscles coiled for action. They had no choice but to fight. They couldn't keep running. Not anymore. He turned to the woman, his voice low and urgent. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll handle this." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. "No, I won't hide. I won't run," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I stay with you." The warrior nodded. He had expected this. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't afraid to fight, not anymore. And neither was he. He stood up slowly, motioning for her to stay low, then moved off the path, his steps light and calculated. The enemy was only a few yards away, and he needed to take them by surprise. The warrior crouched low, his body pressed against the earth as he waited. The figures emerged from the trees, their faces hidden in the shadows of the forest. The warrior's breath caught in his throat. They were closing in, but they hadn't seen him yet. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest, the tension building with every passing second. The first man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area, his hand on the hilt of a sword. The warrior could see the man's breath in the cool night air, the tension in his posture as he waited for his comrades. The warrior held his breath, watching the man closely. He wouldn't get another chance. As the man moved forward, the warrior sprang into action. He lunged, his knife flashing in the moonlight, striking the man in the neck before he could react. The warrior was already moving to the next target. The second man barely had time to register what had happened before the warrior was on him, his blade cutting through the air, landing a quick blow to his side. The man staggered but managed to swing his sword, missing the warrior by inches. The warrior was faster, striking again, this time aiming for the man's chest. He fell, his body crumpling to the ground with a soft thud. The warrior turned to the third man, who had drawn his sword and was now charging at him. The warrior moved swiftly, ducking under the blow and countering with a swift strike to the man's stomach. The man gasped as the air left his lungs, stumbling back before collapsing in a heap. The warrior stood over him, his chest rising and falling with each breath. It was over. For now. He turned back to the woman, who had stayed hidden behind the trees. She was still clutching the child, her face pale but resolute. The warrior's eyes softened for a moment before he turned to face the remaining enemy. There was no time to rest. They needed to move again. The warrior motioned for the woman to follow him. "Let's go. We have to keep moving," he said, his voice low and urgent. The woman nodded and stepped forward, the child still in her arms, her steps steady despite the danger. The warrior led the way, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the fight was far from over. They couldn't afford to stop. "Not yet. I know this is our final chance." The warrior's feet moved swiftly over the rocky ground, the earth beneath him solid and unyielding. He could feel the urgency in every step, the weight of the journey pressing down on his chest. The sounds of the forest, usually so calming, now seemed foreign and alien as the tension grew. Behind him, the woman moved as swiftly as she could, still cradling the child in her arms. Her face was drawn, tired, but her resolve was stronger than ever. They had made it this far, but he knew they couldn't stop yet. The enemy was relentless, and their chance of survival depended on staying ahead. The warrior glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression hard, but there was something softer in his eyes. She had been his strength, his anchor through this ordeal. She had never wavered, never faltered. and despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface, she had trusted him to protect them. They had come this far together, and he would see them through to the end. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low but firm, a promise of hope despite the danger that still loomed. She nodded, but the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. She was afraid. He could see it, but she was still moving forward. That was enough. They reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin, and the moonlight spilled through the canopy in soft, silvery beams. The warrior slowed his pace, scanning the horizon. There, in the distance, he could see the flickering lights of the small settlement they had been heading toward. The end was in sight, but the warrior wasn't ready to relax. Not yet. He had seen too many close calls, too many narrow escapes. "Stay low," he whispered, turning back to the woman. "We can't be seen yet. We need to make it to the edge of the settlement without being noticed." She nodded, her face set with determination, and they moved in silence, their steps quick but careful. The warrior could hear the distant sound of people talking, the clatter of wagon wheels, the hum of activity that seemed so ordinary, so far removed from the chaos they had lived in for days. But that was exactly why they needed to stay hidden. The moment they were seen, the fight would start all over again. The warrior's instincts were sharp, his senses heightened by the danger that still lingered in the air. He knew that the enemy wouldn't stop looking for them, and if they were seen now, it would all be over. He led them through the darkened edges of the settlement, moving with quiet precision. His thoughts were focused, but every so often, he would glance back at the woman, checking that she was still there, still following him, still safe. As they neared the edge of the settlement, the warrior heard something that made his blood run cold. A faint sound of hooves, getting closer. The enemy had found them. The woman turned to him, her eyes wide with fear, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of the terror she had been holding inside. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for the child, afraid for the life they had fought so hard to protect. "They found us," she whispered, her voice shaking. The warrior's heart clenched. But there was no time to waste on fear now. "Stay close," he said, his voice urgent. "We make a stand here. We fight." They couldn't outrun them. Not anymore. The warrior drew his knife, feeling the familiar weight of it in his hand, and turned to face the woman. "Get to the shelter," he ordered. "Stay inside and keep the child safe. I'll handle this." The woman nodded, but her grip on the child tightened. "No," she said, her voice strong. "I'm not running anymore. We're in this together." The warrior felt a pang in his chest, but he didn't have time for the softness of it. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice grim. "They'll be here any second." They crouched behind a nearby wagon, and the warrior motioned for the woman to stay hidden. He peered around the edge, watching as the riders drew closer. There were 5 of them, each one armed, their eyes scanning the area, looking for the slightest sign of movement. The warrior's muscles were coiled, every sense on alert. He had to take them down quickly, or they would be surrounded. As the first rider passed by, the warrior acted, springing from behind the wagon and charging forward. The blade of his knife met the rider's side in a swift motion, the sound of steel cutting flesh filling the air. The rider screamed, but the warrior didn't stop. He moved on to the next, slashing with deadly precision, taking them down one by one. The sounds of the battle echoed through the settlement, but the warrior was unstoppable. His movements were fast, precise, and without hesitation. He fought like a man possessed, his only goal to protect the woman and the child. He knew that they couldn't keep this up for long, that the enemy would soon realize they were being outmatched and reinforcements would come. But he couldn't think about that now. One rider fell, then another, and the warrior was already turning to face the next. He heard the woman's voice calling to him, but he didn't look back. There was no room for distractions. He had a job to do. He fought through the pain in his muscles, through the exhaustion that tugged at his limbs. The battle was won, for now, but he knew it wasn't over. The warrior's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood over the fallen enemies. He turned to the woman, his eyes locking with hers. "We're safe. For now," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, but they both knew that the fight was far from finished. They had survived another battle, but the war was still ongoing. The warrior turned back to the path ahead. They would keep moving, keep fighting, together. In this gripping tale of survival and resilience, the warrior and the woman face relentless danger in the wilderness, with the echoes of a pursuing enemy always close behind. From tense moments of close combat to moments of quiet determination, this story embodies the best of Western stories, where the strong and the brave must fight for survival against the odds. With the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the warrior leads them through dense forests, fighting off attackers and struggling to protect the innocent life of a child. But it's not just the enemy that threatens them. The harsh wilderness itself presents a constant challenge. As the stakes rise in their journey continues, every decision and action could mean life or death. Their path leads them through intense battles and narrow escapes, where trust in each other becomes their only true ally. This thrilling adventure is not just a fight against the elements and the enemy, but also an exploration of what it means to protect those you love. Western stories are filled with these intense moments where survival isn't guaranteed, and the true strength of character is revealed through every trial faced. As the warrior and the woman push forward, they realize that the fight isn't over, it's just begun. This is one of many gripping Western stories where the wild unknown can be both a place of danger and of opportunity, and where every step taken is a step toward a new challenge. If you're a fan of fierce battles, survival against the elements, and characters who defy the odds, then this is the story for you. These Western stories will keep you on the edge of your seat, reminding us all of the toughness and grit needed to survive in a world where nothing comes easy.